Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of, I guess I'll be calling it the Ben Noble Show or podcast. The purpose of this platform is to talk about and discuss subjects that are impactful on a societal level. This includes politics, philosophy, ethics, economics, foreign policy, technology, kind of anything that's interesting and impactful. Well, thanks for tuning in, and let us begin. So, climate change is a hot topic now, and with the likes of Greta Thunberg touring internationally, saying a lot of very serious things about the future of the world. I think it reflects a certain helpless feeling that a lot of people have when it comes to trying to preserve the environment. I know there's a lot of people on all of the spectrum on this issue viewing global warming or climate change as a hoax or negligible in threat level, to people seeing it as an existential crisis and threat to the whole human race or even all life on Earth, as dramatic as that sounds. Regardless, though, I think everybody should be on board with polluting less and ejecting less carbon into the atmosphere. And so I've run into a couple different things recently that's given me an idea, and I'm obviously not the first person to come up with it, but I'd like to talk about it now. And that is, how can we incentivize private companies to reduce their carbon emissions, use green energy, and in general reduce their pollutants. As it stands right now, it looks like there are plenty of companies that are stepping up to that end goal already voluntarily. And I think it's important to have them do this voluntarily. It's more of a ground up approach, right? And getting someone to voluntarily or even engage in activity that is in their best interest, it's the most sustainable and effective way of changing behavior. I am personally skeptical of the government's ability to kind of use the whip to mandate that companies do X, Y, and Z. And there's a lot of problems with having regulations to control things. Special interest groups often write the laws that they are subject to, or at least corporations lobby on behalf of their own organizations. And so there's a lot of problems with regulating certain things to achieve societal outcomes. And so, all that to say, I think there are plenty of ways to encourage companies to take on, let's say, a more responsible environmental posture. So the first thing I want to show you is Microsoft has pledged to reduce their carbon emissions by 2030, I believe, down to, well, basically to go carbon negative by 2030. And then by 2050, their goal is to have removed all of the carbon from the atmosphere that they have ever emitted in their existence, from the 1970s till now. I'll play this little clip here that they released real quick so we can see that.
Like direct air capture approaches that literally remove carbon from the air. And while the world will need to reach net zero, those of us who can afford to move faster and go further should do so. That's why Microsoft is committing to become carbon negative by 2030, meaning that we'll reduce our emissions by half and remove from the atmosphere more carbon than we emit, including all of our Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It's why we're also committing to remove, by 2050, all of the carbon Microsoft has emitted, either directly or by electrical consumption, since it was founded in 1975.
Microsoft is not the first to do such a thing. I came across a Forbes article with 101 companies that have committed to reducing their carbon footprint. And these are legitimate corporations. They are large companies with a lot of people, a lot of resources, a lot of production. So we have some like Land O'Lakes, John Deere. Oh, Monsanto's on there. Interesting. Uh, yeah, BMW. We got automotive here. We got travel. Uh, yeah, just a lot of companies here, excluding government. They're not necessarily companies. That's strange. We got Levi's, Walmart, Target, Nike. I think Coca-Cola's on here. Yeah, so it's pretty impressive, this list here. Even Google is on here, and actually Google was the first company I've heard embracing a more green policy, where all of the energy they use is going to be through renewable energy, which is pretty cool. Then you have some more tech companies here. But overall, there's a large movement in the United States. I think this is all American companies. Okay, maybe not. But either way, there hasn't even been any large scale, at least in the US, there's no large scale green regulation. There's no carbon credits. There aren't any standards put in by the EPA, by and large, on carbon emissions and stuff. But these companies are already embracing, this new paradigm of production. It's the leadership of these companies that are feeling a ping of, responsibility for the environment, and or they are looking at the market as a whole and all the consumers and their values and saying, hey, we need to cater to the preferences of the people that we sell to and the people that invest in us. And that is, I think, the big thing that environmentalists could latch on to in order to help move along their goals of reducing carbon emission and pollution. And it's all about money. It always comes down to money. You can invest in these companies. There's nothing better than I can think of than giving a positive reinforcement to good behavior. And if you don't, there's even ETFs that are being created to cater to this sort of investing. So you don't have to do all this research into what companies are embracing green technologies, what companies are, aligning with your preferences on that front. And you don't have to look into, well, are these companies viable? Are they, sustainable in the long run? Are they making money? Are they worthwhile investing in? If a company is not sustainable, then it's not worth investing in them, right? They should fail, and then someone else with a little bit better idea should be able to come in and take their spot. And so there's a number of ETFs and companies that have specialized in creating these investment vehicles to help people, invest using their conscience. And now here's another thing that I think is really interesting. You can kind of go on the offensive and purchase stocks of companies that do not necessarily line up with environmental policies or preferences. So, for instance, you could perhaps buy stock in, ExxonMobil or any of these oil companies. And why would you want to do that? Because you then get voting rights to help decide how the company is going to be run. And so among the things that are up for, a vote in these companies are who makes up the board of directors, initiating corporate actions, and making substantial changes to the corporation's operations. There's a lot of power in being able to vote directly to influence the activity of a company. And if you think about it, this is the most democratic thing that you could ever do. More democratic than voting in an election to put a politician into office. You don't know what the politician's going to do. It's all commonly understood that politicians lie to get into office, and then they cater to whoever gave them the most money, whatever special interest lobbied them the most. But here you can take out the middleman of the government, and you go straight to the source and start changing it there. And now you could probably say, like, oh, well, your one vote on how a corporation runs isn't going to amount to anything, because there's a lot of people voting. There's a lot of people who are more invested than you are in the corporation. But I would say that applies to voting politically. And actually, voting politically is probably way more unlikely to get you what you want. So in the United States, nationally, there's like 300 million people. I think, roughly speaking, half of the population votes in an election. I think it's a little less, but let's just say half. You have 150 million people voting in an election, and it usually comes down to two different politicians, and then we split, and whoever wins by a little bit gets to be president. But if you are, let's say you own ExxonMobil, and you're going to vote in their I don't know if you call them elections, on any issues that you get to vote for, how many people are voting on them? Well, I would say way less than 150 million. So I think your vote in a stockholder election or ballot is much more powerful than anything you could do politically. And just imagine if you can organize shareholders. It would be much more easily done to accumulate a group of like-minded people and investors to steer a corporation or a company into being more green. I think this is a killer idea, and I'm surprised I haven't seen anybody talk about it. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the people who are really, really scared or concerned about climate change, I don't want to call them alarmists, but the people that say that, we have an existential threat to the planet, I think a lot of them look at corporations and they view them as inherently evil, when it's not quite that way. There's a lot of things that influence how they work, and they still do provide a lot of good for humanity that just right now we're just doing in a dirty manner. They should embrace the opportunity that the free market has given them to directly influence these companies, and much more easily than affecting any political change without having the incentive. Like there aren't any third parties lobbying companies to act in a certain way, because companies have a narrow field of power. They stay in their lane, and other companies can't really mess with them. But when you're talking about politically, man, it's just a big fight over the one ring with all the power, and you're not going to win that way. Or if you do, you're going to be cut under with special interest groups and politicians making backhanded deals all over the place. It's not worth it. So I think this is a really, really good idea. One final point I'd like to make is that I read about this maybe a couple years ago, and it's probably still true mostly. The U.S. government is the largest polluter on the planet. Most of that is due to U.S. foreign policy. Military operations in the Middle East and elsewhere cost, it takes a lot of fossil fuels. And there's a lot of waste that's produced when we go places, especially in the Middle East, like in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we have a bunch of personnel, not as much anymore. But at the height of the war, they were producing, like, everybody drank water out of water bottles. And they produced so much plastic waste. It's hard to imagine how much it was, because everybody just drank water out of bottled waters. There wasn't any, there's some plumbing, and it depends on what installation you're at, but there's a lot of waste involved in policing the world. I think that it's a special sort of irony to approach the U.S. government, which is the biggest polluter in the world, has created a lot of pain and suffering. Basically, the Middle East is worse off now than it was before we got involved. And so I think it's questionable to approach that same government with its same bad incentives and poor decision-making to go about and try to take care of something as important as, taking better care of the planet. Especially if you think that human beings are going to die in the next, 50 to 100 years if we don't do anything about it. And that is actually a good segue to, I think, the last thing I want to talk about for today, and that is the war in Afghanistan. I think it was last week, or at least this month, January 2020, where the Inspector General of the Afghan Reconstruction testified before Congress, was appointed in 2008 to investigate contractual fraud and waste in the war zone, amongst other things like how is the war going? Is it actually being effective? Are mission statements being met? and whatnot. And unfortunately, I think we all kind of knew this, but this just, it's particularly damning when the government reports on itself, says something like this. Their conclusion was that there is a problem where military personnel and leadership are disincentivized to tell the truth about what's going on in Afghanistan. Because, if you think about it, the Army's filled with type A personalities who like to, get things done and say that they're competent, that they're go-getters, that they're effective and creative and all sorts of good stuff, right? And that they can't fail. That kind of mentality is going to mean that when you talk to your boss, you're going to omit the bad stuff. You're going to slightly exaggerate the good stuff. Your boss is going to take that information. He's going to do the same thing, and it's going to be passed up to all the political leaders, and that news and information is going to get pushed out to the public, and then all of a sudden they're lying to us about how the war is going. But we all know it's bad because we've been there 18 years and nothing's better. This is the more detailed article about what the Inspector General found, but I think this one paragraph is pretty enlightening. So this is a 3-star Army general summing up his experience in Afghanistan. We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. Douglas Lute, a 3-star general who served as the White House's Afghan war czar during the Bush and Obama administrations, told government interviewers in 2015. He added, "What are we trying to do here? We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. 18 years, an amazing amount of money, injured and killed service members, and an absolute tragic level of suicide in the armed forces, and the Army specifically, all because leadership in the Army was not able or unwilling to report the truth, and for all the politicians, unwilling to grapple with the reality that we can't fight a war forever." But then we have another layer that we get to look at too. And this leads us to what I think is probably the biggest condemnation of the Pentagon and the U.S. government's ability to manage things, besides it not being our business and we should never have gone in the first place. But the Pentagon can't even do basic accounting, or at least it can't even, maybe it's advanced accounting. They have no ability to actually balance their checkbook and monitor the funds going in and out of their organization. The Pentagon made $35 trillion in accounting adjustments this year alone, a total that's larger than the entire U.S. economy, and underscores the Defense Department's continuing difficulty in balancing its books. The combined errors, shorthand, and sloppy record-keeping by DoD accountants do add up to a number nearly 1.5 times the size of the U.S. economy. The report shows that the Pentagon employs accounting adjustments like a contractor paints over mold. Their priority is making the situation look manageable, not solving the underlying problem. Now, within the $30 trillion is a lot of double, triple, and quadruple accounting of the same money that it moved between accounts. So they didn't spend $35 trillion. Their accounting makes it look like $35 trillion has gone through their books, which obviously it could not have done that. But this is kind of a continuation of its inability to take care of its books. Somewhere in here it talks about their attempt to audit the Pentagon a couple years ago. The Defense Department acknowledged that it failed its first ever audit in 2018. That's pretty bad too. First ever audit in 2018. Like, the Army is like over 200 years old. I don't even know where to begin with that. So it reviewed 2.7 trillion in assets and 2.6 trillion in liabilities, while the authors found no evidence of fraud in the review of finances that Congress required. They flagged a laundry list of problems, including accounting adjustments. So here we have an organization that can't even keep track of the money that it spends, fighting a war that it doesn't know particularly why it's fighting, and won't report on accurately on how the war is going. For a lot of people, especially libertarians, when we look at our foreign policy and we criticize it, we don't see separation of government action in the United States and government action overseas, whether it's war or policing or whatever. The way the war is going and the situation the Pentagon is in is actually a mirror image of what is going on in Washington. Washington spends more than it takes in. It hasn't passed the budget in like 20 years. Its real debt right now, the national government, the federal government's debt it's like 21 trillion. And now that's very real. This is the 21 trillion, and then there's like 100 trillion in unfunded liabilities, I think, for the next 10 or 20 years. It's pretty amazing. The Pentagon in Washington, they can't balance their books. They can't report accurately on facts and how things are going in their separate endeavors. I mean, when you look at what the federal government does, whether it's, like education and healthcare and stuff, they can't even report honestly on what's happening there because everything that they've done has driven up the cost of education and healthcare. Nobody can fess up to what's going wrong, and that's kind of similar to what's the Army is experiencing here, and they can't fess up to the fact that things aren't going well. They don't understand what they're doing. And that's because it's all part of the same organization. There's all the same incentives and lack of transparency and a need to be efficient and take care of the money that they use, because it's all through taxation, borrowing money from the Federal Reserve. There's no real incentive to be smart and to be good because they have all the money in the world. When they run out, they just get some more. To be honest, I think that's why the Pentagon doesn't care about keeping its books, because a couple generals can just go out and talk to some politicians and be like, oh, we need more money. And then you can start banging the war drum and say, hey, we need to give the Pentagon more money. And if you don't want to do that, you're not a patriot and you're a terrible person and you hate America. But then you end up with something like this, and you end up with a federal government, 21 trillion in debt, and it's all part of it. It's all the same thing. Conservatives are pretty bad about this. They at least say that they doubt the ability for the federal government to fix social issues in the United States, or to be efficient, or to do good things. But then they imagine that the same organization can be, righteous and efficient and good with its resources when it's fighting a war, when there's no fundamental difference in the incentives and the structures between the two. So it's a pretty frustrating thing. And I would imagine anyone who sees this video, I bet none of these articles have ever popped up on any of your feeds, and nobody cares. Yeah, it's pretty depressing. Well, on that note, I think this is a good place to stop. Thanks for listening. I will see you in the next one.